Kindly be seated as we will begin our fourth and final session. Your Eminence, Archbishop Demetrius, Exarch of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Your Eminences and Excellencies, Dr. Prodromou, our esteemed moderator.
These lights are really, oh.
Distinguished members of the panel, brother Archons, ladies and gentlemen. My opening remarks will be brief, as I am anxious to hear from the notable members of our panel. And if you allow me a moment of personal privilege, especially from a man who understands the issue as well as anyone alive today, Rabbi Arthur Schneier. Rabbi Schneier, the 2008 recipient of the Archons Athenagoras Human Rights Award, is renowned around the world. A Holocaust survivor, he witnessed the raising of his own synagogue as a teenager in Vienna. As a young immigrant to the United States, he founded over 50 years ago the Appeal of Conscience Foundation to promote, quote, peace, tolerance, and ethnic conflict resolution, unquote. And after the destruction by the Taliban of the Buddhas of Bamayam in Afghanistan, two of the largest statues of Buddha in the world, dating from the 4th and 5th centuries, he spearheaded the United Nations resolution that calls upon nations of the world to, quote, and I quote, exert their utmost efforts to ensure that religious sites are fully respected and protected in conformity with international standards and in accordance with their national legislation, unquote. As we commence our dialogue today, I leave you with this thought. Unless we commit to all religious sites, the protection of all religious sites, whatever their religious or faith origin, we cannot protect any. From the Sufi tombs in Timbuktu destroyed by ISIS, to the Armenian cemetery in Julfa, Azerbaijan, decimated by the government itself, from the desecration in the Mount Carmel Jewish cemetery in my own hometown of Philadelphia, to the seized Hagia Sophia churches of ancient Nicaea and Trabzon in Turkey. We must be concerned for all sites and all religions. As Christians, we want to protect our own, but we must also show the world and the overwhelming majority of peace-loving people of faith, whatever their faith that may be, that we are as concerned about their own spiritual centers as about our own. Thank you. At this time, I invite our moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, to lead this fourth and final panel discussion entitled Destruction of Sacred Sites. Dr. Prodromou is a leading academic authority on religion and geopolitics and is a well-known expert on Orthodox Christianity and Islam. She holds a PhD from MIT, and during her exceptional diplomatic service as Vice Chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2004 to 2012, she exposed the religious freedom violations of Turkey, resulting in naming the Republic of Turkey to a country of particular concern, a CPC country, or a watch list country on USCIRF's annual listing of the world's worst religious freedom violators. The world world's worst religious freedom violators, a distinction that Turkey continues to shamelessly earn to this very day. Dr. Prodromou.
Good afternoon to the audience, Your Eminence, Archbishop Demetrios, other eminences who are here, friends, Archons, and of course, esteemed panelists. It's a pleasure to be with you at this third Archon Conference on International Religious Freedom, and in particular to be addressing the very urgent situation of Christians in the greater Middle East. So it's a pleasure to be with you, although to discuss such a sobering subject. You have the complete biographies of all of the panelists in your program, but I'd like to say a little bit about each of the panelists, just to highlight the particular set of expertise and the real complementary set of expertise that these panelists bring to our discussion on property rights and sacred sites. And I'd also like to encourage you, you'll see, I think at each of your places, there's a piece of paper if you'd like to write questions for the question and answer portion of our panel. And likewise, I believe that there are copies of the United Nations resolutions that Rabbi Schneier will present to you when he begins his conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about each of our panelists. I think you'll see the impressive scope of their expertise and their commitment to the protection and the sustainability of Christians in the greater Middle East, but more generally to the human rights and religious freedom of all human beings around the world. I begin with Archbishop Vicken Aykazian, who was born in Turkey in 1951, and he completed his studies at the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, so from Turkey to Jerusalem. He has a long list of achievements that relate to the topic of our panel, including country director for the Fund for Armenian Relief in the capital of the Republic Armenia, Yerevan. He's participated in the World Council of Churches as an auspicious participator for years and years. In 2005, he was also elected president of the National Council of Churches here in the United States. So he's moved seamlessly from academic studies to work in humanitarian relief and also in ecumenical context. He's a leading figure. He also was appointed in 2009 to then President Obama's Advisory Committee on Faith-Based Initiatives. And he was the first American clergy member ever appointed, I believe, to that council. We also have with us Ambassador Patrick Theros. Ambassador Theros is a career Foreign Service officer, retired now. He has a long and illustrious career of appointments. He joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 1963. He has a distinguished career as a Foreign Service officer, and I emphasize the word service because we oftentimes lose sight of the fact that to be a diplomat is to serve. He earned 4 Superior Honor Awards in his career. He was accorded the personal rank of Minister Counselor in 1992, and then he also received the President's Meritorious Service Award and the Secretary of Defense's Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service. So again, service is key, and I want to come back to that because I think we're all here thinking about what each of us can do in our professional and vocational spaces to serve the cause of human rights, universal human rights, and certainly to help sustain Christians in their beleaguered condition. And so service will be important for us. And then finally, retired Ambassador Theros is also the representative of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem here in the United States. We also have with us Kate Nahapetian, who is the executive director of the Armenian Legal Center for Justice and Human Rights, a newly founded organization, I think growing organically out of her work as government affairs director for the Armenian National Committee of America. Kate has done numerous testimonies, congressional testimonies in the U.S. Congress. She is an expert on property rights and sacred sites and the connections between them. She's an attorney, and her service, I think, is also, it's very impressive, albeit in the space of law. And then finally, certainly last but not least, we have with us Rabbi Arthur Schneier, who has been introduced to you on numerous occasions over the past day and a half, but there are some things, again, that I would really like to call to your attention as they relate to the topic of our panel on property rights and sacred sites. He founded the Appeal of Conscience Foundation in 1965, and the Appeal of Conscience Foundation, for those of you who don't know, it's an interfaith coalition. It includes business people, it includes religious leaders, it includes foreign policy leaders, and again, from their various spaces of service, vocation in their professional lives, come together to discuss and to promote and to support international human rights law when it comes to freedom of conscience, belief, and religion. He is the recipient of numerous awards and medals, including the Presidential Citizens Medal from President Bill Clinton. And I want to read the quote there. On behalf of his service, again, as an international envoy for 4 administrations, and of course as a Holocaust survivor, devoting a lifetime to overcoming forces of hatred and intolerance. And Rabbi Schneier is also the rabbi of the Old Park East Synagogue. I think it's one of New York's most historic sites. So it's a pleasure to be able to welcome all of these panelists together. I want to take a moment to say a little bit about why we are having a panel on property rights and sacred sites, why these two things together. Dr. Limberakis mentioned that I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for 8 years. And one of the things that became very clear to me during my service on the commission, as I traveled around the world, places as far-reaching as China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, was the fact that property rights and sacred sites are very much linked together. The issue of sacred sites and how that relates to the survival, but hopefully the long-term sustainability of Christians in the Middle East and the Holy Lands, I think is something more self-evident. But let me give you a few thoughts for your consideration before we begin. When we think about sacred sites, we tend to think about churches if we're talking about Christians. But I'd ask us to think more broadly, because what I've seen around the world is that sacred sites not only include churches, of course, they include monasteries, they include cemeteries, they include museums, they include archives, they include libraries. They include all of the structures that ultimately give expression to the historic presence and to the future, hopefully, of those communities. And sacred sites are important because not only do they offer the opportunity for those communities to live and express who they are, but they're a form of remembrance. And what we see around the world is that, and particularly in the Middle East, that assaults on sacred sites, on all these different types of sacred sites, are designed, first of all, to humiliate those people, Christians and their sacred sites, to remind them that they are second-class citizens, unfortunately, that they're not equal before the law. And what we also see is that both states and non-state actors perpetrate attacks and assaults and the destruction of those sacred sites. And so we see either acts of commission or omission designed to desecrate, obliterate, and in some cases, using this antiseptic but ultimately horribly vulgar term, to repurpose those sites. My father was from the island of Cyprus. If you go to Turkish-occupied Cyprus, you'll see that sacred sites have been turned into casinos, into hotels, into military pillboxes, into public toilets, into barns. Those are some of the things that happen in the so-called repurposing of sacred sites, and then also, of course, converted to the use of mosques or other religious traditions. So we need to keep in mind the broad range of sacred sites and remember as well that when sacred sites are gone and the people are gone, there's no way to remember that they ever once were. Destruction of those sites is a form of memoricide, and I hope we'll keep that term inside, memoricide, because it kills the memory that those people once were. So the people and the sites are organically connected. How does this relate to property rights? Again, traveling around the world and seeing what's happened to Christians in the Middle East, oftentimes we tend to look for external signs of destruction and elimination. But there are other ways that Christians and other vulnerable communities in the region see their ability to sustain themselves undermined. And that's usually through more pernicious, non-violent forms of discrimination, marginalization, and persecution. And property rights are one of the most egregious forms of that kind of discrimination and persecution. We see very punishing property rights, punitive property rights regimes that have been used to systematically disenfranchise Christians economically from the societies in which they live. So their properties are expropriated. Their properties are arbitrarily claimed by the state or by other actors, fellow citizens, and there's no due process for them to recover those properties. So these are intrinsically linked. And I'd like all of our panelists now to offer us their introductory statements, and then we can drill down more deeply into their area of expertise to kind of amplify these connections. We begin with Rabbi Schneier, if you don't mind.
Thank you, and I will comment on your valuable work with the Interreligious Freedom Commission. But first, I'd like to publicly acknowledge and pay tribute to my beloved friend, our beloved leader, His Eminence, Archbishop Demetrios, who has been an invaluable partner, not in terms of interreligious dialogue, but interreligious action. Action, not speaking, doing. As a trustee of the Appeal of Conscience Foundation, and you have before you the resolution that was passed by the United Nations on the 11th of June, 2001, for the protection of religious sites. It was not an easy task to accomplish in the United Nations. You know, you have all kinds of coalitions, some against, some for, but it was really a united collective action. Cardinal McCarrick, Archbishop Demetrios, and again, I can't tell you how fortunate we are to have Archbishop Demetrios, whom I gave the title of prophet yesterday, as a valuable leader on the American religious scene. So God bless you, and only good health and many years of continued cooperation. You will also find in the documents resolutions. The first one, which was a privilege co-hosting in Constantinople with His All Holiness Bartholomew in 1994, with the support of Pope John Paul II, and many President of the United States, and many other political and religious leaders, at the height of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Again, collective action. I'm going to come back to these declarations, but let me just give you why am I so engaged in this terrible crime against humanity, the destruction of holy sites. I was 8 years old, my hometown Vienna, November 9th, Kristallnacht, on my way to the synagogue, after the plundering throughout the night and the screaming and yelling by people who I considered friends or family, and all of a sudden turned against our Jewish population. On my way to school, I saw my synagogue burn, and the fire department standing by, only concerned about what's going to happen with the neighboring buildings, shredding the Torah scrolls. And you know, there's nothing like a childhood experience. And I kept on saying that over 920 synagogues were destroyed in Germany and Austria on November 9, November 10th at Kristallnacht. So when I see a church burning, when I see a mosque burning, when I see a temple burning, a synagogue burning, immediately I have that visual recall. I see my own synagogue. And when I go back now to Vienna, there's nothing there, absolutely nothing. So this led me to the establishment of the Appeal of Conscience Foundation in 1965, and our mission was religious freedom for all in the Soviet Union. And I don't have to tell you that under the communist rule, every religious faith community was oppressed. Not only oppressed, but if you wanted to open up a church, you had to go through a hierarchy to get permission to have that. And you know what? Khrushchev closed 8,000 churches. I met the Patriarch Kirill of the Moscow Patriarch. His residence in Danielov Monastery, you know what that was? It was a juvenile delinquent center under the communists. And when it came to property return, you know, years, in Eastern Europe to this day, it takes years for churches and all religious institutions to get their rightful property back. So let me just quote to you something which a very famous Austrian writer, German writer, Heinrich Heine. Heinrich Heine in 1837 said, "Those who burn books will burn human beings." 1837. How relevant that statement. And I want to qualify. Those who burn holy sites will burn human beings. And that's true in the Middle East, it's true in Asia. And one of the reasons I believe that religious minorities are suffering because they're not given equal standing to begin with. And one of my signature campaigns, and I just gave a major address to the diplomatic corps in the Vatican last June at the United States Embassy. You know, we all speak about tolerance. We want tolerance. I don't like that term. Because if you use the term tolerance, it means you tolerate me, or I tolerate you. That I'm superior and I tolerate you. Now you're going to find that, for instance, I went to Morocco and I met with the Archbishop, and it was in the 80s, of the Catholic Church in Rabat. And I said, "Do you have freedom?" He says, "Yes, we have freedom. But." Well, what's the but? Prohibited from opening schools, in terms of marriages, a whole list of buts. So as far as the outside world is concerned, sure, religious freedom, but as a second-rate, third-rate citizen. Historically, Jews in the golden age of Spain were still second and third-class citizens. You go to Turkey, you talk about, you know, equal rights and equal standing. Well, my beloved friend Archbishop Aykazian and Barsamian will tell you, Armenians are not given the same rights as the Muslim population, or His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, who is still referred to by the Turkish authorities as Rum Patriarchate. They don't want to recognize him as the Ecumenical Patriarch. And I keep on telling that famous story when we hosted this conference in 1994, and we issued invitations by the mayor and the governor, and of course we put down His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch. They protested, Rum Patriarchate. So you know what I said to them? I said to the Foreign Minister, if someone is known as Mr. Smith throughout the world, you call him Mr. Brown, we'll call him Mr. Smith, okay? So that's what you have when you tolerate. So I think what's important, let's forget about that word tolerance. And let's forget about dialogue is only the first step in terms of cooperative effort. And we have to stand in this together. I served President Bush and President Clinton as chairman of the U.S. Commission for the Americas Heritage Abroad. And my commission's assignment was to protect religious sites in Europe. Why? Because, as you said, cemeteries were cleaned up. I remember dealing in Warsaw with the mayor of Warsaw. They wanted to extend the subway lines, so they wanted to remove 3,000 graves of the Jewish cemetery. And it took a lot of negotiation to save that cemetery, okay? And then another experience in Doha, since you served Qatar, okay? Speaking about tolerance, you find that in Qatar, and I'm very close to the Sheikh, who has done a lot in terms of education, you find that Qatar has every second year an interreligious conference, bringing together religious of all faiths, which is commendable, commendable. But when you go to Qatar, there was a Grand Mufti every Friday on radio and television, speaking against Christians and Jews. You know what I'm talking about?
Gardawi.
All right. So to summarize, because I can go on and on, I hope you understand the difference between what I call the ultimate aim is mutual respect and mutual acceptance. I emphasize mutual respect and mutual acceptance. I respect your belief, respect my belief, and accept me as I accept you. That is the ultimate aim. How do you begin? You start first with dialogue. Get to know one another, okay? Then the next step should be not tolerance, doing things together. Just as I heard, is All Holiness in Jerusalem now, today?
Yes. Yes, yes.
Again, it's not only, I can tell you, His All Holiness does not believe only in talking. He believes in action. That's why, you remember the sea voyages in terms of the environment? That's all what His All Holiness is all about. So, first step is dialogue. Second step is collective action. And ultimately, the goal, because we have many, many, many challenges to face in this turbulent world of ours, ultimate goal is mutual respect and mutual acceptance. And that is going to give us the strength that is needed to face a turbulent world in transition today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Kate?
Thank you. His Eminence Archbishop Demetrios, Your Eminences, distinguished clergy, fellow religious freedom defenders, it's an honor to be here to speak to you today. I wanted to talk about lessons that we can draw from past acts of violence and genocide committed against the Christian community in the Middle East, in particular the Armenians in Ottoman Turkey, the Armenians and Greeks and Assyrians. Property issues were integral to realizing the genocide, because if you dispossess the community, you ensure that they're impoverished and they cannot resist the policies of persecution. If you take away their religious sites, you ensure that they will not return as well. It's a matter of impoverishing the community so they cannot resist and ensuring that they cannot return. There were massacres committed against the Christian communities of the Ottoman Empire before the Armenian genocide. What was unique to the genocide starting in 1915 was the use of property laws to ensure that they did not return. So when the deportation orders were issued against the Armenian community, they prevented the Armenians from selling their properties. They told them they would be able to come back. But once they were deported, they actually started creating property commissions to sell off the properties for the Armenian community. And they were never able to return. Of the over 2,000 churches that existed, the Armenian churches before the Armenian genocide, less than 50 of them are operational today in Turkey. Only only 3 of those 50 are outside of Istanbul. And it's no coincidence that there's very few Armenians outside of Istanbul because there are no churches to minister to that community as well. So some people believe that if we have laws and treaty obligations, that this is one way of protecting the communities. It is one way, but it is not enough. Before the genocide, there were already treaties, actually, that protected the Christian community of the Ottoman Empire. Many people believe that human rights obligations only started after World War II, but that was not the case. There was the Berlin Treaty of 1878 that obligated, the Ottoman Empire signed it, and it obligated them to treat their Christian minorities equally, gave them political and civil rights, but it wasn't abided by. So the most important thing is not just having the laws and the treaties in place, but having legal mechanisms that are effective to exercise those rights. So, and accountability. After the genocide, the international community believed in accountability. They said we have to force Ottoman Turkey to account for these crimes. They had the Sèvres Treaty of 1920 that envisioned returning properties to the community, even if third parties were living on those properties. They envisioned holding the perpetrators accountable. Turkish forces fought back. The international community acquiesced, saw that it was going to be costly to bring about accountability, and they acquiesced and signed a new treaty, the Lausanne Treaty. So there's a lesson here, because there's a lesson in long-term vision for the future based on accountability, which is expensive and it's hard. But what's more expensive and more difficult is impunity. It's because of impunity that the Christian and other minority communities in Turkey continue to face persecution, continue to have their lands expropriated. It's because of impunity that other parties in the region, including in Syria and Iraq, that they've learned that lesson. There's the famous quote from Hitler himself saying, "Who today speaks of the Armenians?" That was a very expensive mistake that we made by not following through on accountability. So a lot of times we think about just the short-term policies and interests rather than the long-term solutions. So how do we respond? One issue is to create effective legal remedies for minority communities. Another one is to document the properties, to make them toxic for third parties to use. When you don't have the effective remedies, at least you can decrease the profit motive in using these properties by third parties who care. Maybe that the government who's expropriated them doesn't, but third parties might, including corporations or other investors. And third, public pressure. For instance, in 2011, the Armenian community, in cooperation with the Greek American community, Assyrian community, led by the Armenian National Committee of America, passed a resolution calling on Turkey to return Christian properties. Within weeks of that resolution passing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, overwhelmingly, including by Turkey Caucus co-chair members who voted for it and didn't speak against it, Erdogan announced that he was going to start returning Christian properties through a decree, but only for properties that were confiscated after 1936. The vast majority of Armenian properties were confiscated before then, but it shows a step how public pressure can have an effect. When it comes to foreign property interests, it's foreign investors like corporations, there is a whole mechanism through bilateral investment treaties that allows for foreign investors to rely not on the domestic courts, because it's clearly that there's bias against them in the domestic court for properties that are expropriated, that they've created agreements where you have an arbitration where you don't have to rely on the domestic court that's expropriating your property. So one of the, I think, a potential solution is to create a mechanism for religious minorities to have this third-party arbitration, because like foreigners, religious minorities are at a disadvantage in their communities. There is bias against them. There is an they are a weaker party. So I'm proposing, looking to see how we can learn from the corporate model of creating this third-party arbitration to resolve property issues. And that's the Armenian Legal Center. One of the things that we're doing is documenting the properties that were taken on our website, thearmenianlegal.org. We've created a page where people can let us know about the properties that were expropriated, because this information can be corroborated by Turkey's own land registry documents, whether it's something that's important to both the Greek and Assyrian communities as well, because their properties were taken. And I think that's the first step, is the importance of documenting these properties and also raising awareness. And a long-term solution is maybe creating a special arbitrational commission for religious minorities in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Patrick.
Your Eminence, Dr. Limberakis, Elizabeth. I'd like to particularly thank you, Elizabeth, for your opening statement about the importance, the relationship between property and the presence of religious groups, whether it's Christian or anyone else, frankly. You take the property away, you take the identity away, you take the presence away in the end. And Elizabeth asked me half an hour before this program started if I could give her my opinion on President Trump's announcement today that the United States will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. 3 days ago, the news came out that he was planning on doing so, and frankly, this left the assembled heads of the Christian churches in Jerusalem terrified. They issued a letter on the 6th of December directed to President Trump, and I will read you the excerpts besides the flowery language that starts the letter. Referring to an early letter that was written in 2007, the 10 heads of churches in Jerusalem write, "Mr. President, we are confident that you too will take our viewpoint into consideration on the very important status of Jerusalem. Our land is to be a land of peace. Jerusalem, the city of God, is a city of peace for us and for the world. Unfortunately, though, our holy land with Jerusalem, the holy city, is today a land of conflict. Those who love Jerusalem have every will to work and make it a land and a city of peace, life, and dignity for all its inhabitants. The prayers of all believers, the 3 religions and 2 peoples who belong in this city, rise to God and ask for peace. As the psalmist says, 'Return to us, God Almighty, look down from heaven and see. Inspire our leaders and fill their minds and hearts with justice and peace.'" Mr. President, we've been following with concern the reports about the possibility of changing how the United States understands and deals with the status of Jerusalem. We are certain that such steps will yield increased hatred, conflict, violence, and suffering in Jerusalem and the Holy Land, moving us further from the goal of unity and deeper toward destructive division. We ask from you, Mr. President, to help us all walk towards more love and a definitive peace, which cannot be reached without Jerusalem being for all. Our solemn advice and plea is for the United States to continue recognizing the present international status of Jerusalem. Any sudden changes would cause irreparable harm. We are confident that with strong support for our friends, Israelis and Palestinians can work towards negotiating a sustainable and just peace, benefiting all who long for the holy city of Jerusalem to fulfill its destiny. The holy city can be shared and fully enjoyed once a political process helps liberate the hearts of all people that live within it from the conditions of conflict and destructiveness that are experiencing. Why are the churches of Jerusalem so concerned? Why are, frankly, very worried about the change in status? The United States is the most powerful and most important country in the world. Since 1947, it has recognized the status of Jerusalem as a separate corpus separatum in the 1947 partition resolution. We have every other country in the world, in fact, recognizes, outside the region, recognizes Jerusalem as a separate entity belonging to no country until such a time as the interested parties, which are primarily, but not exclusively, the Palestinians and the Israelis, can reach a new resolution on the status of the city. For the Christians and for the churches, this is particularly important because of two recent developments that frankly put our continued existence in the city of Jerusalem at risk. Recently, a group of 40 members of the Knesset submitted a bill to the Knesset calling, that will allow, if passed, will allow the Israeli government to confiscate the land of churches, specifically of churches. The bill is not aimed at general landowners. It will allow the state of Israel to confiscate the land of churches that is being used, that is being leased out, leased to third parties. The state of Israel will determine, a loan without recourse will determine the conditions of the confiscation, and a loan without recourse will determine the value of whatever compensation there is for confiscation. Secondly, we are faced with a situation of some 10 years ago where an attempt was made to fraudulently obtain new leases on land inside the old city by an organization known as Ateret Kohanim. Ateret Kohanim, for those who don't know it, is a fringe element that has been denounced by virtually the entire American Jewish community, with some very few exceptions, that is determined to evict all non-Jewish population in East Jerusalem and in Greater Jerusalem entirely. They buy land, they engage in tactics like harassing their neighbors once they occupy a building or a property. They've beaten up priests. They recently set fire to the theological high school in Jerusalem. They spit on women, and they generally do whatever they can to disrupt the life of people whom they want out of the city, which includes many Jews who don't share their views of the world. This fraudulent claim has ended up in court. The court case was extended for 10 years. Recently, despite all the evidence proving fraud, the court of first instance, a single judge, has decided in favor of Ateret Kohanim. The Patriarchate has appealed this decision to Israel's Supreme Court. All the churches in Jerusalem have again come out with a statement objecting both to the new law and to the finding of the court case, because both cases are a violation of the status quo. And it's really important, because I use the word status quo with capital S, capital Q. This is not simply a description. The status quo is the official name of a regime that was established in the 1700s by the Ottoman Sultan, that defines the relationship between the state and all the churches and other religious groups in the Holy Land. The status quo also defines the relations between the churches, things like who gets to go what procession on what day in the churches, as small and as low down as that. It is all states, when you succeed another state, it becomes a legacy, a legal legacy. The British Mandate, when it took over after World War I from the Ottoman Empire, specifically accepted the status quo as part of its legislation in the Holy Land. And when Israel was created, it specifically accepted the status quo as part of its legacy. This Kingdom of Jordan, when it occupied and annexed the West Bank and Jerusalem, specifically accepted the status quo. And the Palestinian Authority today has specifically accepted the status quo for territories it controls. These bills, this bill and this court document, this court decision, will upset the status quo. They run the risk of making it null and void. Now, why is this important? First of all, because this is the way Jerusalem has been governed, that has permitted the minorities, the Christians, the Jews when they were minorities before, and so forth, to live in harmony. It's never peaceful. People get mad at people, but it's to live in harmony, in a regulated harmony that has determined how everyone lives in Jerusalem. And why is land so important? Right now, these 10 churches between them administer more than 1,000 holy sites. These 10 churches between them have over 150,000 kids in schools. The Orthodox Church alone maintains perhaps 15 to 25,000 refugees on the Jordanian border. All of that money comes from the land that the churches own. If you take away the land that the churches are leasing or renting and have as revenue, you cannot sustain the presence of the churches in the Holy Land. We're finished. It's not even up for argument. We are absolutely finished. The amount of money that comes in from pilgrims and donors, I doubt, certainly in the case of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, does not reach 5% of the cost of maintaining the Patriarchate. I do not believe that the state of Israel as a rational government wants this to happen. Unfortunately, due to the influence of Atarei Kohanim and some other political parties and some people, again, we're talking about human beings who see enormous value in the properties of the religious institutions, are pressuring a government that is sitting on the edge of collapsing should one of 7 parties in the government decide to pull out. We're faced with this crisis. It is at the top of the agenda of every church in Jerusalem. And it really is, how can I say, Jerusalem, let me just describe this. Christianity in Jerusalem is the buffer that has permitted the city to function properly. It is the buffer that has made it a welcoming city to everybody from outside who comes to see the holy places, regardless of whether you're Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. That presence, the status quo that governs that presence, is absolutely essential to keeping Jerusalem what His Beatitude Patriarch Theophilos wants it to be, which is a single open city, open to all to come and worship. What are the solutions?
Patrick,
maintaining the status quo.
before we get to the solutions,
Yeah.
can I ask you to,
Yes.
I'd like both of you to talk more in more detail about this, but I'd like also Archbishop
Sure.
Aykazian to jump in, because I think he also has some recent knowledge on this, but more broadly to come back to some of the things Kate was talking about. I have to play the unhappy role of time moderator. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Okay.
I got carried away.
Okay.
I'm honored to be here, especially at the presence of His Eminence, who is not only the Archbishop for the Greek Orthodox Church, but he's the Archbishop of many other churches, including my church, Armenian Orthodox Church, and Oriental Orthodox churches. So it's a pleasure and honor to be in his presence, to be able to speak to you. It's a very vast subject to talk within 20 minutes or 25 minutes, the question of property and holy sites. It is true I was born in Anatolia, and I am the grandson of an orphan who did not know whether she had parents, brothers, or sisters, or any relatives. So she was one of the lucky ones that was saved after the Armenian genocide. I'm not going to go on to speak about the Armenian genocide. I just want to speak a little bit about the property and holy sites. Last week when I was in Jordan, Amman, with the Executive Committee of the World Council of Churches, I had a conversation with the representative of the Czech Republic who was telling me how they have been in touch with the government, and the government is giving back all the properties that have been confiscated during Second World War and the churches. And if the churches were destroyed and replaced by a building or something, the government is paying for that one too. Well, after 100 years, the Turkish government is just playing with words and playing the politics that is very unique to the Turkish the government, and telling that, yes, we are opening churches for the Christians in Turkey, that we are giving back their property. Well, let me speak about three different kind of properties that exist in Turkey. First, it's the property that were confiscated either by the local people or by the government between 1950 and 1923. Smyrna, that was burned in 1923, was a city populated by the Greeks, Armenians. And today, there are no Greeks and Armenians in Smyrna. The same thing with other part of Turkey. Since 1915, they have given one Armenian church back, and that church also recently was desecrated, burned. The icons were completely burned, and it's in a very bad situation. It's in Diyarbakir, the capital of historic Armenia. If I'm not wrong, they have given one church in Pontus to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate as well. And then the preaching goes around the world that we are giving back the properties and the churches to the Christians in Turkey, and they call us the Christian minorities, which we are not. We have never been minorities in that country. We are the indigenous people of Constantinopolis, Asia Minor, Anatolia. Armenians had 2,600 churches and monasteries in Anatolia. Today, there is only one church in the city of Van, which Armenians are not allowed to celebrate except once a year, and that's in September. The same thing is for the Greek Orthodox. There are thousands of churches that have been either converted into mosques or are being used as barns or warehouses, or they have been demolished. The Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem has about 950 pieces of property in Constantinople, Smyrna, and some part of Asia Minor. We have been trying to get in touch with the Turkish authorities through the lawyers for the last 10 years. Not a single piece has been given back to us. And I can assure you the same thing is for the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The difficulties that are created by the Turkish government has been ignored, unfortunately, by our so-called friendly countries, European countries and United States. The reason for which they do not want to do or they don't do something said that, well, Turkey is an ally. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey is the only country in the region that is supporting us, which is not true. We have seen recently what happened when the United States needed Turkey just to use Incirlik airport to attack Iraq. The United States was refused. By the way, Incirlik airport is a piece of land that belongs to the Armenians. And some Armenian organizations are in touch with the State Department to get the papers in order to take them to the court, but there is no answer. I'm very much concerned. But I'm not concerned only about the Christians of Constantinopolis, of Anatolia, of Armenians, you know. I'm very much concerned about the Christians on the whole in the Middle East. I have been traveling. Actually, I came last night from Geneva, and we discussed with our some very important Jewish friends about human rights violation, about religion and violence. And I was in Egypt. 10 days ago, I was in Jordan. I had the pleasure of meeting with His Beatitude Patriarch Theophilos. We discussed the situation of Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Jerusalem, about these two buildings. They have expressed themselves openly, trying to explain their situation, that they have been misled, if I'm not wrong, by a certain person who has disappeared, who is in Greece. Of course, the head of the churches have made some statements about those two properties at the entrance of the old city of Jerusalem. I'm very much concerned about the Christians of Syria, about the Christians of Iraq, and about the Christians of Egypt. During my conversations with President Sisi or Prime Minister of Iraq or Barzani, they all support us, but they don't do anything. Unfortunately, in coming 10 to 15 years, there will be no Christian left in Iraq. In 1990, the population of Christians in Iraq were about 2.5 million. Today, there's less than 200,000 left. The same situation is in Syria. I mean, I speak for my own community. We were about 90,000 Armenians in Aleppo. Now there are no more than 20,000 or 15,000 left. And we don't know what could happen in the future, because the future is not bright at all. I don't see a green light in the tunnel that situation is going to improve. And one of the questions that Elizabeth wanted me to answer, what will be the post-ISIS situation of the Christians in Syria? It's too early to speak about that. It's too early. Because we don't know what's going to happen. Have they eliminated ISIS? Not yet. It will take time, not 1, 2, or 5, or 10 years. It will take much longer. What could be done? I think you, as the representative of the Greek community in the United States, could do a lot. I think you could write to your congressmen and senators and representatives, you know, to push Turkey to accept the reality, to acknowledge the reality. Atatürk says, whoever opens a school, he is blessed. Well, my question to the followers of Atatürk is that, how come then you close down Halki? How can you close down a school? I hope one day President of Turkey will answer these questions. And I hope one day they will tell the truth. The persecution of Christians have never stopped. And I don't believe that it's going to stop. There is less than 1% Christian left in I think the Jewish community was about 22, 23,000 people. There are 16,000 left. Because their policy is not only against the Greeks and Armenians, but it's against the Jewish people as well. So I think I stop here, and if there's any question, I'm ready to answer.
Thank you, Archbishop. Thanks to all of you for really kind of laying out the terrain, and I think very nicely making clear the point that property rights are undergirding communities' abilities literally to sustain themselves, and that if you impoverish communities, then sacred sites may remain, but there will be no people to use those sacred sites, and that sacred sites themselves are essential to communities' ability to live robust and free lives. I'd like to come back to a couple of points. First is to ask you, Kate, to say a little bit more about the environments, because the subtitle to the title of this conference is Consequences and Solutions, and all of you have touched on solutions, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the judicial spaces in which communities who have had their properties expropriated or destroyed can best seek recourse. If you could just say a little bit about whether these are international courts, whether we're talking about the International Criminal Court, whether we talk about the ICJ, or whether or not with Rabbi Schneier, the work in the United Nations, or whether they should seek recourse to domestic courts. And then I'd like to come to our other speakers as well.
Okay, thank you. There are several avenues for redress, none of them easy. One of them would be in the Turkish courts, but that has been very problematic because you're talking about it's the Turkish state that was responsible for this illegal confiscation. So there was actually a lawsuit that was filed by the Catholicosate of Kilikya based in Antilyas, the Armenian church there, for a property that is in Sis, in Kozan, Turkey today. And they pursued it in the Turkish Constitutional Court, and in order to make their case, they needed the document records that are in Turkey's land registry. And so they tried to get that documentation. It was denied. It makes it very difficult to present your case if the government is denying you access to the documents you need to make your case. And they were denied. The Turkish Constitutional Court said, oh, no, you needed to go to the Turkish lower courts, and instead of doing that, they appealed to the European Court for Human Rights. So that's your next step. You go through the Turkish courts, and then you can go to the European Court for Human Rights. But unfortunately, the European Court for Human Rights recently ruled that, no, you needed to spin your wheels, spend a lot of resources that you don't have as a dispossessed minority or dispossessed community, and so they kicked it down the can. They kicked the can down the road. The European Court did not want to touch this, and they had an easy excuse, which was you needed to do more work in the Turkish courts. So the church, it's unclear what they're going to do next, whether they're going to try to still make another plea to the European Court that the circumstances have changed. The Turkish court system is not a viable option, especially after the coup, or if they are going to have the resources to pursue a multi-year legal effort in the Turkish courts. Another avenue would be the domestic courts in, let's say, the United States, because in the US, a sovereign is normally immune from a lawsuit. But there are exceptions, and there is a pending case, including the Incirlik case, where it's Bakalyan versus Turkey, and it's pending in the Ninth Circuit, where you can sue Turkey if they took properties in violation of international law. And there's very strong arguments to say that this was a violation of international law when you targeted a specific religious community for eradication, destruction, and have not returned their properties. The International Court of Justice is only a place for state-to-state claims. So a church would not be able to bring a claim before the International Court of Justice, but a state, for instance, Potentially a state could bring a claim, but it would be hard for them to say that they don't have the property interest that's at stake. And I don't believe there have been any cases in the International Court of Justice dealing with religious properties.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Go ahead.
I look to all of you, and I'm sure that either your parents or your grandparents were not born in the United States. So you have a recollection. What was shared with you by your parents or grandparents, or maybe your own experience. I think in terms of property, I think what you and I can do is make an inventory, recall, of all the properties all the churches that you recall existed in place A, B, C, and D. And then this would be a wonderful project for the Archons, an inventory. And then submit that inventory to our administration, to congressmen, senators, so that you have something factual, you have evidence in terms of you may not see them rebuild, because unfortunately there are no Armenians left in most of Turkey today. But at least you have a record, and you can claim restitution, and for historical purposes it can be remembered. The other thing I want to comment on is that, you know, we're all in the same boat. We either swim together or we sink together. And all I can tell you that you mentioned my friend Archbishop. You know that, how many of you know the name of, the biblical name of Mosul, M-O-S-U-L? Recaptured now from ISIS, right? A terrible place, brutality, where they killed, massacred children, women, rape, whatever, okay? And as you've heard, with a sign that if it was a Christian home, you were doomed to failure, all right? Well, let me tell you, that used to be the city of Nineveh. Biblical city, Prophet Jonah. And many of our prophets were in that area. So this was a cradle of Judeo-Christian civilization living there. That was Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, we do not teach geography in the United States. So most people don't know what we're talking about. Mosul is not just an Iraqi place. It's a biblical place. It's a biblical place. And I recommend to all of you to read Prophet Jonah, the book of Prophet Jonah, because he was commissioned by the Lord to actually chastise the people of Nineveh, okay? And he didn't take on the responsibility. That was not accepted, okay? The other thing that I think, to summarize, what we learned from Prophet Jonah, you cannot escape. You cannot be indifferent. You cannot just say, okay, what's happening over there doesn't affect us. It does. It does affect, it has an impact on each one of us. And coming back to what you said, displacement of Christian communities, you know that until 1950 in Iraq, there were 250,000 Jews. Today, maybe a few hundred. So now we're talking about a world, 65 million people are migrants, displaced from their roots, from their homes. We cannot just talk about isolated places. This is a mass phenomenon that's not only in the Middle East, in Asia, all over the world. 65 million people are refugees. Yeah, that's right. That's what we're talking about. So you have 2 million, actually, there's a wonderful book written by Cardinal Filoni, who's in charge by the Holy See, was the envoy of Pope Francis on Iraq. Just wrote a book on Iraq. And you find that 1.5 million Christians have been displaced. Yes. Okay? I recommend that I'll send you the book if you want. So that's one issue. And if I just may take one other minute, because I'd like to just comment to you, Ambassador. First, I think whenever we talk about Israel and Jerusalem, we always also have to look at history. And not only talk about history, but if you read the Psalms, King David, where did he reside? King Solomon. This is our Bible, okay? They didn't live in Tokyo. They lived in Jerusalem. And whether UNESCO agrees or doesn't agree, and I'm a former ambassador to the United States, to the United Nations, the fact is that King Solomon's temple existed. No one can deny that. So I must say that I was not consulted by the White House in terms of that decision, okay? So I'm not going to say anything. But I do want to say something, though, that you find that all throughout the Middle East, unfortunately, Christians have been kicked out. And there's an increase in Christian population in Israel, the only place where the Christian population has increased and not decreased. Now, you also mentioned something about 40 members of Knesset. It doesn't bother me. You know why? If we have 465 members of the United States Congress, and you have a Tea Party or any other party, caucus, introducing a resolution does not mean that the government, the responsible government, will act on it. So don't just go about on the basis of what 40 Knesset members are going to do. They can introduce all kinds of resolutions, but you still have a responsible government. And the other thing that you should be very clear, there's a clear understanding that the entire status of Jerusalem is subject to the negotiation of both parties. That's a clear understanding. We have come away from the idea of the internationalization of Jerusalem. It's a clear understanding. And I think that basically the very fact that this decision has been made by the President of the United States, he has not ordered, at least I didn't see the communique, the move of our embassy yet, because he understands that this is all subject to negotiations. And we have to work together to make sure that the current situation that exists in Jerusalem today and Israel today, I've been in Jerusalem just in June. I've visited the churches, I visited the Armenian quarter. People worship. There's no interference in terms of religious worship. There's no interference in terms of education. And discount those, extremists who we have in the United States too, unfortunately, who are trying to push one way or the other. But if we pull together collectively, I think we can see a continuation of the kind of peace that Pope Francis and His Holiness Bartholomew, when they came to Jerusalem, we were there. We had a delegation there. That kind of peace that we all hope will exist, it will come to reality. So, and also I think I've heard too many times that, this government is going to fall, it won't fall. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I'm not speaking on his behalf, he has been in office all these years, 4 terms, more than Ben-Gurion, all right? So you never know. We never expected a radical change in our government here, did we? So we cannot just prognosticate and say, this government is so shaky that it's going to react and so forth. Again, you have to understand that we have to understand our history, and we have to understand not only what's happening in that region, but what's happening in the world that has an impact, You find that today the impact in the Middle East is Russia and Iran, which cannot be discounted. And if you want to talk about religious liberty in Iran, you know what that is all about.
Rabbi Schneier, before we get to Iran, which is another conference in and of itself. If I could pivot off of what you've said and ask Patrick if you want to respond, and I think say a little bit more about this idea of, we all survive together or we all perish together. I think, Rabbi Schneier, you've emphasized that in an interfaith way and in a global way. One of the things that's come up throughout the conference, and Patrick, you touched on it in the statement of the 10 churches, is that churches themselves are beginning to learn how to work together. One of the, I would say, the paradoxes of the tragedy of what's befallen Christians in Iraq and Syria in particular, but more generally, is that various denominations within Christianity have begun to learn how to work together. So I wonder if you could say, just conclude where I had to interrupt you, about what the churches themselves are doing together in terms of this issue of their own holy sites, but also in dialogue, as Rabbi Schneier says, with other faith communities with regard to the specialness of and the uniqueness of Jerusalem.
Yeah, I must admit that until about 10 years ago, the degree of cooperation between the churches in Jerusalem was close to zero. They were even though we were all Christians, all sharing the holy places, we tended to regard the status quo as something to be beaten up and to take advantage of, I'm going to clean this particular piece of tile so I can get control of it. The last 10 years has changed the focus of all the churches there. In part, I think it's because the personalities have changed. Patriarch Theophilos' beatitude took over a church that essentially had not reorganized its administration since after the Second Crusade. This is a 2,000-year-old institution. It's interesting because of for example, every one of the cases that have gone to court, that have been in the newspapers, every one of them was a case that had been raised well before his beatitude took over in 2005. So these are all issues that we are trying to organize. The degree of cooperation now between the churches is, as I said earlier, much greater than I have. I am not trying to ascribe bad motivations to the government of Israel. However, I have spent my entire adult life in the diplomatic service, and one of the things I've learned is that all governments are vulnerable. And governments stay in power by trying to address the vulnerability. At some point, one of those 7 parties that make up the Israeli government is going to go to Netanyahu and say very simply, you vote this way or we're out of here, and the government collapses. Netanyahu may be able to finesse it. He may not be able to. We don't even want 40, by the way, is 1/3 of the membership of the Knesset. That is equivalent to 150 members of Congress co-sponsoring a bill, which is virtually unheard of in the U.S. House of Representatives. So we believe that it is necessary for the government Netanyahu to see the problems this will cause him in the future if he allows this to proceed. Again, I don't personally believe that he wants to take over the land. There are people who do. There are very significant people who do. Some of them are doing it for money. Some, like Ataret Kohanim, are doing it for nationalist and religious reasons. I'd say primarily nationalist rather than religious. We all live in Jerusalem. We've been living in Jerusalem in one way or another for thousands of years. It is not a city that can be regarded as exclusive to one faith. Even when the Muslims took Jerusalem in 632, within a month they signed an agreement that more or less has been observed since then, the Treaty of Omar, that guaranteed the position of the minorities in the city, primarily the Christians, but of the minorities generally. So the old saying, from your mouth to the ears of God, I do not in any way am looking for a confrontation, nor are we looking for a confrontation in Jerusalem. We are looking for a way to settle this thing quietly and without political repercussions. We are not the churches in Jerusalem have made it absolutely clear that they are not part of the political difficulties facing the country. We are not part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We were not even part of the Cold War. So this for us is an exceedingly important issue, and it cannot be simply wished away.
Thank you. I have one question here. We have, I think, time for one question. We began 10 minutes late, but we're going to actually try to end on time. And I'm going to direct this primarily to Archbishop Aykazian, although anyone could answer. But I think this is something you have particular expertise on. It says, His Eminence Archbishop Demetrios described the message of His All Holiness as, quote, a text of pain, unquote. In this very message, His All Holiness highlighted Western-backed policies of regime change as a source of this pain. Is the further weakening of the Syrian state a solution to this pain, and what would be the consequences of a continuation of these policies? Now, for whomever asked the question, I'm going to slightly edit it, and I'm going to ask you maybe to focus in particular on the Christians of Syria, and what you see, and again, if you could answer this, probably you'll win a Nobel Prize, but how you see the way forward for the Christians of Syria in terms of what's bandied about quite regularly in this town, a stabilization solution. Where do Christians figure into a discussion about a post-war Syria, and in particular, how do these legal issues of property rights, but also protection and rebuilding of sacred sites fit into a future for the Christians of Syria, who were at least 10% of the population before the war began?
Whether we like him or not, President Assad was very, I'm going to use Rabbi's word, very tolerant towards the Christians in Syria. Of course, there are two important churches, Antiochian Orthodox Church, the center of Antiochian Orthodox Church, and Syrian Orthodox Church are in Damascus. They did not have problem with the Syrian government because they were just doing their business. They were not involved in politics, and the authorities were tolerant towards them. I don't believe that there will be a future for the Christians in Syria, especially for the new generations. After all these sufferings, they want to have a free, secure life. And I don't know whether security is going to come to that region or not. When I met with the church leaders, 13 church leaders in Baghdad, and repeated the same thing in Syria, one of my questions was that if I ask you what are your 3 priorities, what do you think you are going to answer to me? One of the archbishops told me, number 1, security. Number 2, security. Number 3, security. Unless there is security, people are going to leave. And who is going to bring that security? The authorities. Are they ready? I don't think so.
On Syria, we're not going to see Syria the way it existed until now. It will be fractured. And I must agree with you, Archbishop, that despite this tragic record in terms of President Assad's performance, he's an Alawi.
Yes.
And he has certain loyalties to the Christian community. Syria is now like different tribes. Yeah. And you have now a battle of influence with Russia is back in the picture. Russia did not exist. Thanks to Henry Kissinger, we squeezed Russia out of the Middle East. Russia is very much part now in the solution of this tragic situation. So you have different areas that are going to be ruled by some who are in favor of Iran and Russia. And also Assad owes his survival because of the Russian-Iranian influence. And that has, in my opinion, it's a very turbulent transition period, but you're not going to see Syria the way it existed, which has serious implications, you know, as far as the Christian community, minority community in Syria.
One of my questions to diplomats, one of our American diplomats, about a few months ago, I said, what have you achieved in Syria? Oh, he said, we are very successful. We have achieved to create 3 countries out of 1.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was something that was prepared. It's not just something that coming out of nowhere.
Just to complete, Syria, I think, offers an instructive lesson for all of us here as we wrap up this final panel. That discussion about Syria and the partition of Syria is oftentimes discussed in terms of an Alawite zone, a Kurdish zone, and a Sunni zone. Notice that Christians are not part of that picture. Yes. And I raise that issue not only because that obliterates Christians and Christianity from Syria, but it also reminds us that we need to speak about facts on the ground. And the facts of the Middle East are that Christians are organic to the Middle East. They're indigenous to the Middle East. They may be a numerical minority today in the Middle East, but there's a reason for that. There's a long series of causes that have produced the outcome of Christians being a numerical minority. So as we leave this place, it's incumbent upon us to learn our history, to not be fearful, instead to be fearless in speaking the facts of history. And as John Adams reminded us, facts are uncomfortable things. We shouldn't be uncomfortable, however, in speaking about historical facts, because it's only in speaking the truth of those facts that we'll move away from the kind of glib and easy discussion about Assyria that would exclude Christians and ultimately would do damage to all of the faith traditions, believers and unbelievers alike. Pluralism cuts across faith lines, but it also exists within faith traditions. And we must remember that the Middle East is a place of extraordinary, or it was once, religious pluralism. And it's that religious pluralism that gave vitality to the Middle East, that made it the birthplace of so many civilizations. And as Christians, we must learn our facts, we must learn our history, and we must be willing, along with all of the other traditions, faith traditions and communities in the region, to be committed to that region as a place of religious pluralism and rule of law, and most importantly, equality before the state. There can be no second-classness, there can be no toleration, and there can be no separate and unequal, to quote someone that I know well, a historian who I happen to be married to.
Just do not forget some of the Christian communities that are in difficulty in Africa. Also Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country, 230 million, okay? You find that until recently, there was a certain amount of coexistence, tolerated. Now you have more violent extremist Islamists pushing the government. That's right. So again, it's not only an issue of Middle East, it's also Christians in Sudan, Christians in part of Africa, and all I can say, you're not going to solve the world problems, but what you can do is educate your children and grandchildren. Educate your children and grandchildren in terms of mutual respect and working together for the good of mankind. That each one of us can do. You have to leave some things up to the White House, to the Secretary of State, to the world statesmen, or the very courageous trip that Pope Francis just made to Myanmar. Again, also a situation. As we sit here, Bangladesh exiled 100,000 Muslims into an island. Yeah. Okay? It's a great humanitarian issue, problem. So again, we either swim together or we sink together across the board. Thank you.
That's right.
I'd like to thank this outstanding panel moderated by Professor Prodromou and the participation of Ambassador Theros, His Eminence Archbishop Aykazian, Attorney Kate Nahapetian, and our beloved Rabbi Arthur Schneier. The Archons at this point will digest, analyze, synthesize the results of these 4 panels. We will develop a strategy to act and certainly to offer the truth in love, as St. Paul said. And we look forward to continuing this struggle for religious freedom, not only for the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but for all the Christians around the world, we're talking about the Middle East, who exist under the most severe circumstances, discrimination and persecution. So at this time, I want to thank the panel, the moderator, and we will have a bit of a rest until 6:30, at which time we will convene in the lobby. There will be buses departing at 6:30 for the farewell dinner. We welcome His Eminence, who will be giving us our parting remarks, and speakers.